Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. This is Marti Arvin with Synergistic. We're here to talk about information blocking and APIs. What are your risks and what can you do to prepare? So before we move any further, I want to level set with everyone and make sure that you're all prepared for what we're going to talk about. We're going to do a brief summary of the rule, but then we're going to get into some pretty technical discussions of APIs. And so if you're like me and you're not a highly technical person, some of this may be something that's unfamiliar to you. Feel free to ask your questions throughout. And if we don't get to all the questions during the course of the presentation, then we'll try to reach out to you afterwards and do some follow-up. I also want to make everyone aware that if you're the non-technical person on your team, again, like myself, this will be put up on our website, and if you want to direct your more technical people to it, to listen to it, or if you want to listen to it again because you might not have captured everything, then it's going to be out there and accessible for folks. So can we go to the next slide, please? So our agenda for the discussion is going to be an overview of the information blocking rule, and it's going to be very high level. And then we're really going to get into the meat of the discussion and talk about demystifying APIs, go through a technical review of the OWASP top 10. We're going to talk through some security testing considerations, and then we always put questions as the last item on the agenda, but again, feel free to type questions throughout in the question box, and we'll try to get to them if we can during the course of the presentation, and if not, we're going to try and leave time at the end to talk about those questions. Next slide. Andrew, you want to give an introduction?
Absolutely. So my name is Andrew Bindner. I'm a senior red team consultant here at Synergistic. I may have only been with Synergistic for a year now or so, but I have been in the security community for 20 years. I was a veteran, or I am a veteran of the United States Navy. I was in the cryptography program. I co-authored Hacking with Callie, which is available on Signgrass. Fair warning, please don't buy the book. I know it's weird to hear from an author, but it's really outdated. It's back from Callie 1.9. But as far as my community involvement, I've presented at RSA for U-boot security on IoT devices, cybersecurity summit. I did a couple IoT and car hacking, and then Secure West Virginia, which was HackerCon back then, doing a wireless 4-hour primer. I have a passion for all things when it comes to penetration testing, but my real true love is IoT hacking. And the big reason for that is you test network, web, mobile, API, everything within the entire ecosystem of the device. So my job literally at that point becomes void all the warranties, and it's absolutely what motivates me to get up in the morning. Marty?
Thanks, Andrew. Now I'm a little bit scared as I've heard you say all that. But as I said at the beginning, I'm the less technical person on the call. I'm an executive advisor for Synergistic. I do have 30+ years experience in healthcare. I'm one of our subject matter experts on topics like healthcare compliance programs with a focus on the HIPAA privacy, security, and breach notification rules. I have a lot of experience developing and implementing compliance programs, including the privacy and information security programs around that. And I hold a number of certifications from the Healthcare Compliance Association. Next slide. So let's dive right in and just do, again, high-level overview of the information blocking rule. I will point out that we do have some podcasts on the Synergistic website that go into a little more detail on both information blocking and interoperability. And so if you want more detail on those, then you can go to those references. So basics of the rule. What is information blocking? Well, it's any practice except if it's required by law that you not share the information, or it's covered by one of the exceptions of the information blocking rule that is likely to interfere with any access, exchange, or use of electronic health information. And so I think it's important to understand that if you're required by law not to share information, that would not constitute information blocking. And then we're going to, again, high level touch on the exceptions that the rule has created. Who does it apply to? Well, the rule references actors. And if you don't fit into the definition of an actor under the rule, then it's not applicable to you. So that's going to be important to evaluate that. I suspect many people on the call do fall into one of these categories, but they are the health IT developers of certified health IT. And a point to make here is that this definition includes people that both actually develop it as well as anyone who offers certified health IT to another party. So if, for example, you have Epic and you use Community Connect, you would be offering certified health IT to those other parties to whom you're extending your instance of Epic. So don't just think it's those folks out there that are creating that certified health IT. You could be falling into this definition if you offer it as well. That would not include instances where you develop your own IT information on this. So if you develop something in-house as a provider for your own use, you would not fit this definition of a developer. It also includes health information exchanges and health information networks. Now, they list these separately, but they actually have the exact same definition. So it's those instances that have two or more than two unaffiliated parties, and you have the control over the exchange and access to the information. And then, of course, healthcare providers is exactly what you might expect it to be. Organizations, hospitals, physician practices, nursing homes, skilled nursing facilities, etc. Next slide. Now, what does it address? As I mentioned, the access, exchange, or use of electronic health information. Now, electronic health information is not exactly the same definition of PHI under HIPAA, but it's very, very close. And why it's important to understand that it's a different definition is what you have to be prepared to use, to exchange or allow access to. After the enforcement date of April 5th of next year, you have to be prepared to give access to, exchange, or allow use of the data elements that fall under the USCDI version 1. Now, a lot of clients have reached out and said, well, we don't use that as a standard. We don't use USCDI as a standard because it's not a standard for certified health IT. You're absolutely right. And so it's not requiring you to use the standard. It is requiring you to look at the data elements under that standard and be prepared to allow access, exchange, or use of those data elements. However, after October 6th of 2022, then you're going to have to be prepared to share any data elements that would fit the definition of the designated record set under HIPAA. So that's a much broader data set, but you do have some time to prepare for that. Next slide. I'm sorry, Andrew, can you go back just a second? I kind of touched on this, but I didn't explicitly say it. The enforcement and compliance dates for the rule for sharing the USCDI data elements is April 5th of next year. I think enforcement is, potentially likely for developers, HIEs, and HINs, but probably not going to see much enforcement for providers initially. And I say potentially available because we have a proposed rule out there for the civil monetary penalties that will be applicable to the HIEs, HINs, and developers, but it's not a final rule yet. And OIG has said they will not enforce that rule until at least 60 days after the rule's finalized. So, we don't know when the rule's going to be finalized. It could be before the April 5th date. And so it could be that it's out there, and even, if it's finalized, let's say January 15th, then that means that the 60 days after that publication, it would become effective, and it would be something OIG could use to enforce. So there's potential there that if you're one of those three types of actors, you could have enforcement. For providers, however, the enforcement mechanism is slightly different. The enforcement mechanism will be through disincentives. And the rule for disincentives has not even been published as a proposed rule yet. So the likelihood that that rule will be finalized by April 5th of next year is, I think, very, very slim. But what we don't know for providers is whether there will still be enforcement for activity after April 5th, even though the rule around enforcement and the defined disincentives that are going to be part of the enforcement program may not have been finalized till sometime after that. So just be cognizant of that. And then, as I said, the second date that's important for the information blocking rule is that as of October 6th of 2022, for providers, you have to be prepared to share those data elements that are part of the designated record set. Next slide. Now, as I mentioned, there are some exceptions to the rule, and there are 5 exceptions that if you fit within the exception, you're not obligated to share or provide the information. And I'm, again, not going to go to the details of these, but you see it's preventing harm, privacy, security, infeasibility, and health IT performance. I will touch on the idea that if you don't have the capability to share all of the US CDI data elements within your system, you might be able to fit the infeasibility exception. So that's something you're going to want to analyze between now and April 5th and determine that. Other exceptions apply to the way in which you share the information or the way in which you would fulfill the request for access, exchange, or use. And those are content and manner. You can charge fees in some instances, and you can require licensing in some instances. And I put the website here from the Office of the National Coordinator that has their document on the exceptions to the information blocking rule. So that's something you can reference, and there's a little more detail. But I will also point out that these exceptions are very nuanced in some instances. And so this is going to be something that you're going to want to make sure there's a process in place to evaluate and have someone determine whether the exception does or doesn't apply and what documentation you're going to need to support that. So as I said, very high level overview of the rule. The real meat of the presentation is in the technical aspects around the APIs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to get into that part of the presentation. Andrew?
All righty, thanks a lot, Marty. Yep, so we're going to cover demystifying APIs first. So we're going to start at a high level and then work our way actually through some examples that we've seen from testing our clients within just the last year, and going over and comparing that to the OWASP top 10. So a data-driven life. People are obsessed with data. I guess I know that some of those who are on the call right now or who may be listening to the recording afterwards, we are, or we know a few individuals that are all about the numbers and constantly overanalyzing so many aspects of their life. However, while this is probably the first thing that comes to mind when you look at the title of the slide, that's not necessarily what I mean to say. What I mean to say is we as a society live data-driven lives. Our thirst for knowledge, it may seem overwhelming, but the data has evolved. And as a process of that, so has our decision making. This is probably going to carbon date me a little bit here, but I remember being a kid and watching the movie Tron. For those of you who don't know what the movie Tron was, Tron brought everything from networking and computers and data transfer into a visually personified story from the computer's component level. Everyone and everything had a purpose, a design, but we, the outsiders, the users of the computers, didn't really see what was going on in the background. So let's fast forward 2030, almost 40 years into our current present. Our data has changed from private logs and data sheets into databases and digital fingerprints. We are way beyond dial-up and you've got mail. People may still not know how their computer actually works, but most are aware sometimes at a level of paranoia, what their personal information is like online or what it will be when it goes digital. There's just no stopping it at this point. Because we're always connected, the technical rock stars, or the digital sages, if you're as old as I am, are overwhelmed by the surge for data access. Ultimately, the problem is that this isn't a problem. This is just normal change, and security just has to keep up. People and organizations want their data, and they want it now. So let me ask you, think about this. How do we move all that data around? How do we give people the mobility, the interoperability, the unification without degrading our bandwidth? Pat yourself on the back if you said APIs, because that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. APIs are the worker bees of the internet. So much like the movie Tron, everything has a purpose. Whether it's to turn on or off a light, control traffic, relay camera statuses, share healthcare information, or even open a barn door some random farm in Iowa and let the cows out in the morning, everything has its place. So let's have a quick look at APIs in action, or how they operate under the hood, to give us a little bit of insight on how we might not think about these worker bees. For instance, my daughter wants to buy a product. She goes on her laptop, her cell phone, her tablet, her computer, whatever. She logs into a store account, buys the item. Simple for her. However, the API worker bees in the background have placed a fill ticket, checked inventory, printed a shipping label, instructed a person at a warehouse to pack an item, virtually loaded a truck to make sure that it's space saving, sent an email confirmation of her purchase, updated her advertisement analytic ID with Microsoft, and then sold that information to a third-party company to generate additional revenue. Whew. Okay, so you can see that APIs really do a lot of the heavy lifting that goes on in the background. So our APIs actually end up being the unsung heroes of the internet, our mobile applications, our IoT devices. The reason for this is that they're efficient. They're GUI-less. Sans GUI. No GUI, no problem. APIs just move small chunks of data back and forth. It is obviously a little more complex than that, but at the high level, that's ultimately what it's doing. But let's think about what type of data is moving in the background. Especially in the medical community alone, there's PII, PHI, insurance, billing, medical studies, employee information, and let's see, financials or environmental data. From the moment someone walks into a clinic or a hospital, that first shot to that final bill, everything is cataloged. And now going forward, healthcare providers are going to have to share that data. So, you know, security professionals, start your engines. We are here to talk about the OWASP Top 10. So OWASP, if you're not familiar with it, is the Open Web Application Security Project. It is a very large open community. Anyone can join it. Security professionals, technical evangelists, and even hobbyists and tinkerers. Everyone can join these projects. I think that there's close to 200 open projects that they support right at the moment. There may only be like 100 or so active with ongoing development, but ultimately OWASP, their goal is to improve the security of software. So if you're a developer or you work in security, if you're technically inclined, if it's towards mobile, web, API applications, software in general, or how to even set up your web server, you'll probably find information on their website about how to do that. And you might think about reaching out to your local OWASP chapter. They have they do multiple conferences every year and kind of set the standard on really great information when it comes to sharing and doing conferences and things like that. Now, if you've worked in healthcare for more than 5 minutes, you know that there's rules and guides and compliance standards and etc. It can be overwhelming. But when it comes to actual penetration testing or security guidance, OWASP is one of the gold standards. They provide checklists, they provide educational material. In some cases, it's very deep level guidance. If you're a penetration tester, you've probably looked or hold it close as a Bible to do very specific testing on micro little areas of web applications. Most of those who are probably listening in have at least heard of the OWASP Top 10. But for the remainder of the talk, we're going to talk about the OWASP Top 10. Well, obviously you can see I scratched it out there. We're going to talk about the top 8, and I'll explain. So I know I just gave OWASP a load of praise, but I think that somebody was seriously overreaching when it came to the naming convention of this particular top 10. Some of these, when a lot of people look at them, they don't make a whole lot of sense. I often visualize there's a scene from Office Space where one of the characters is standing in front of the printer and he's screaming at it and hitting it, going, PC load letter, what does that mean? So I'm going to break them down. When you think about these more so as categories rather than individual findings, it actually makes a little bit more sense. The last two at the very bottom are their 9 and 10 and their top 10, and I'm just going to briefly touch on those. Improper asset management. This is just geek speak for not taking care of an ugly baby. Things in this category are like a lack of documentation, insecure deployment in a developer environment where security might just be lax overall, but it accesses production environment. And one of the more common instances of what we see is an organization will deploy an API, so a brand new API, so version 2, version 3, version 4, etc., but they forget to remove the old version, which may actually have vulnerabilities in it. And those would all of those types of things would fall under improper asset management. Insufficient logging and monitoring is literally just as it sounds. You can create 1.5 million scenarios here, but ultimately at the end of the day, if you're logging but not monitoring, or you're not logging and not monitoring, how are you going to know that something is actually happening in your environment, or that there could be concerns, whether it be through security concerns or even just data analytics with a heavy amount of data coming in because maybe you didn't have like rate limiting set or something. But I digress, and I will continue. So broken object level authorization. This is actually shortened to BOLA. If you've worked in web application security, this literally is the same thing as insecure direct object reference. The short for that is IDOR. So BOLA and IDOR are the same, BOLA being for APIs and then IDOR being for web applications. But ultimately, there's a flaw in the business logic and the design of the permissions surrounding the actual API objects themselves. So on the right-hand side here, we see a series of GET and POST requests. In the top one, the patient is authenticating. So they make a GET request out and it logs their patient ID. They've logged in, they get a token, etc. In the next one, they go out and they get the status of results that they see. And maybe that status has a summary of what was done in, say, lab results and what they're owed, and the payment is due, and payment is like $500. Perhaps by changing the object from a status 1 to a status 2, we can change from payment due to payment or to paid in full with a zero balance due. This is the #1 finding for the OWASP top 10. It's because it is the most prevalent. Once identified, these types of issues are relatively easy to fix. However, they're also not hard to find. So you can find them, great. You can fix them, great. The problem is that the larger the API set of objects becomes, the more intensive and resource intensive it is to test each of these objects against their scope permission set. For this particular finding, BOLA security checks can be routinely scanned through with automation and integrated into CI/CD or DevOps life cycles of your API. Having automation in this area can save a lot of time, a lot of money, manpower on the back end, and if you have a permission set for your users that is the more roles you have and the finer grain you get with those permissions, the more time it actually takes and the more resources it takes to test for this. Let's see, broken user authentication. So most security folks should be familiar with this type of vulnerability. The key word to focus on here is authentication. Let's do a little word association. Broken user authentication, broken authentication, weak authentication. Now we're getting somewhere. This stems from weak passwords, weak policies, weak lockout, weak or no encryption of the authentication tokens themselves. Example on this last one, there is sending an authentication token perhaps in the URL of a request. As somebody is on a website, maybe there's an API that operates in the background, but that token is sent in the URL. So as it traverses the internet and gets logged all over the place, that access token is out for retrieval if somebody manages to break into logs of any kind, whether it be local or on the computer, or if there's a reverse not a reverse proxy, if there's a proxy or the ISP's logging things and so on down the line. So it obviously should go in the body of the report. But on the right here, we can see this GET request is actually one of the most prevalent GET requests for WordPress sites. By simply going to medical.info, or in this case, any site, .com, .org, etc., that has a WordPress, you can go to the WordPress JSON version 2 and then go to users. And this will allow an unauthenticated user or an unauthenticated malicious actor to see all usernames within a WordPress instance. If you are sitting there on the other side of this conversation and you're thinking, oh, maybe I should go check my WordPress, they actually did release an update not too long ago that got rid of this, but we constantly see this in environments when we're doing our penetration tests. So if I was playing the malicious actor in a pen test, I might go check out these usernames and go look through open source intelligence, which is basically a fancy way of saying I'm going to Google everything I can about these usernames. Perhaps I can find some exposed credentials or default values for common names. Maybe I can form together a common password dictionary, and then I can perform password guessing, password sprays, or credential stuffing. Credential stuffing is a relatively new term. I think it's only been around for a couple of years, but for those who may be unfamiliar with credential stuffing, it's instead of guessing or spraying a single password, it's grabbing exposed credentials from the internet, former or database breaches, things like that, where you have a known value pair, whether that be 2 days old or 2 years old, it doesn't matter. You go through and you just spray it across the internet as that's a valid credential pair. So that's what credential stuffing is. It's just another form of password guessing, really. But a malicious actor can attempt this in the hundreds, if not thousands, just in a matter of seconds, really. When you're looking at broken user authentication, you really want to focus on protecting the users beyond just simply the password policy. The best defense here really is actually, the strict password and lockout policies, using CAPTCHA, storing encryption keys safely, making sure that those encryption keys are actually using a strong, long authentication key, making sure that the protocols that are surrounding the authentication process are good and strong as well. This is an area where you should really get to know your NIST series. Special publication, let's see, what is it, 863 Bravo actually gives guidance on how to set passwords and password policies and what those recommendations are. But what we oftentimes find is that our clients haven't gone and read the annexes that are associated with those. And the annexes actually provide supplemental guidance for cases of, well, if you don't have multi-factor authentication, you should probably increase from an 8-character password. If you don't have a CAPTCHA or a lockout, you should probably increase it a little bit more, etc. So you should really get to know your password policies and lockout policies, and then make sure you're hardening the system on that one. Excessive data exposure. Yes. Okay. The key here is how much data is too much data. In my opinion, this particular finding set should always follow the security principle of least privilege. Depending on each role or permission set that you have within your API structure, you should be limiting the amount of data per role to only what is absolutely necessary. On the screen here, you can see a picture. This is from the 2018 API breach with Panera Bread, in which case the security professional was able to see all of the usernames, real names, and there was actually more than just here, but this is just one picture that was openly shared to show that some credit card information was leaked and things like that. But there was no reason for an authenticated user, or I think actually in this particular case, an unauthenticated user, to be able to have access to this particular GET request. So the best defense here is making sure that you're checking each call for the information that it actually spits out. You'll want to make sure that you're limiting the number of records, that you're limiting the number of fields, and if there's sensitive data, that it's either masked before it gets to the browser. So shortened in this case, if you take a look, the credit card numbers are starred out in the first few characters. You don't want the browser to handle the, to handle that. You don't want that to be local. You want that obviously to be done at a gateway or a backend server to only serve, if you have to serve sensitive information, you only serve what is absolutely necessary. I do not recommend, if you're reviewing your API, that you do this one with an automation, because this one really requires the human element, somebody who's ethical and diligent enough to go through every call and make sure that they're examining what type of data comes out and what and how that really fits into your company's security posture. Lack of resources and rate limiting. Okay, so I absolutely love this one. It is super common, but this is especially important if you have an API that is cloud hosted. You see, every bit of data costs money, especially if you're in like AWS or Azure. Every request, every portion of bandwidth that you're using, it all costs money, and it adds up real fast. Without rate limiting, you're allowing malicious actors to literally just pound away at your API at your expense. But ultimately, what it can give malicious actors the ability to do is brute force. So our very own Keith Cox absolutely great tester, by the way. He was in a web application for a client of ours, and after he got access to the admin console, further access into the sensitive areas, had this kind of page blocker, and it's a 5-digit code to enter. So because the API in this case did not have rate limiting or a lockout or CAPTCHA, anything to detect multiple attempts or bad attempts, he literally just scrolled from 00000 to 99999. It was a very high, large number that he eventually got it to, but because there was no rate limiting in place, he ended up being able to gain access into that secured area of the application. So this is fairly self-explanatory. By not imposing rate limits, you're opening the door to excessive data usage, resource exhaustion, excessive size file uploads, denial of service, brute forcing techniques up the wazoo, and potential data exposure, because the more amount of time that I have as a malicious actor to sit and interact with an application, especially in the case of brute forcing, it's really just a matter of time and diligence. So testing for these categories, this particular category rather, it can be quickly identified through automated scanning, and this is one of those that I would definitely hand over to the automated scanner to be able to do. A penetration tester or an internal security person can do it, but it's really not quite as sufficient as having an automated scanner do it. So now we move into the broken function level authorization. So, okay, this is one of those funky names again, but at first glance, this is very similar to broken object level authorization, or BOLA. That was the first one that we talked about. Pardon me, but it's a little bit more than that. These types of vulnerabilities are more focused around the authenticated account role. And what that entity actually has access to. So on the right, we have a patient that received an email about a payment notice due. So they log into their web application or from their mobile phone, et cetera, and eventually it gets them to the billing. So that API endpoint goes out and it pulls all the billing. So this API in this scenario is it allows the authenticated user to view the credit card information really quickly. Now, if we took billing out of this, I'm sure that all of us, or the majority of us who are here right now, have all been to Amazon, where Amazon catalogs all of your credit card information. So this is kind of the same scenario that we're looking at here. But in this case, with billing, a user should not be able to do anything more than process a payment and view their bill. They should not be able to simply delete that bill. The delete function would be more of an administrative function, or something that's set by a, once payment is processed, it's an automated system function that it has access to go in and delete the bill. So in this case, the malicious actor can actually modify the HTTP method to delete the bill, where they shouldn't even have access to that particular HTTP method for the API endpoint. Scenario 2 is changing, so the same user that is there simply just goes and accesses the admin's portion for billing, and the application displays all of the credit card information for all of the users in the database. In this case, the malicious actor gained access to all the PII and PCI related data that they could ever want, or need for the moment anyway. To control this, developers really need to pay attention to access roles. The access at each role, and even further per permission. So we've had some clients that they maybe only have 1 or 2 predefined access roles, whether that be a user, a local administrator, and then like a God mode system administrator. But we do have more emerging clients that are breaking that down, where they have 6 or 7 different roles, and then within each of those roles, each one of those can have customizable permissions or access to specific parts of the application itself, have access to the data that's being called and referenced by the API. A really good example of that one would be something like Salesforce, or even Epic, really, where you can have a doctor, but you can have a doctor residing over a particular department who has access to just X, Y, and Z data. So you can get the finer grain you get, the more permission sets that you can have, but depending on how large your roles and how fine grained your permissions are, this, just like BOLA, it's a time intensive and resource intensive process. So an automated vulnerability scanner in this case can really take a lot of the bulk heavy lifting. It can do it in a scheduled, efficient manner. But I would honestly recommend that a security professional work in tandem with that automated process. The reason for that being that if your API documentation is even off just a little bit, or it wasn't pre-programmed and set by the developer and reviewed at that time, it's hard for a machine to determine that, yes, this level plus these 5 permissions out of the 10 should have access to X, Y, and Z data. That is something that a human element can really pay a lot more attention to. So the technical automated portion of the scanning could handle the bulk of it, but a human being should really follow on for a regular review on 6 months or a year, etc. Okay, mass assignment. All right. I'm going to jump on my soapbox for a half second. This is probably the worst naming convention, and I regularly answer questions around mass assignment. Mass assignment is a collection of vulnerabilities that are focused around privilege escalation, lateral movement, data tampering, silo escape, basically bypassing security restrictions one way or another. It's just kind of an all-encompassing thing to say mass assignment. The one thing that mass assignment doesn't really cover as far as the OWASP top 10 is command injection, code injection, which is actually number 8, and we'll get to that in a minute. So in this case, anything that may lead to privilege escalation or data tampering, security bypass, we can see here on the right, I had open in Postman. I was reviewing an API for one of our clients, and I could see when I would go update my user details, all the information associated with my account, including the groups. I was in my own groups, and I could simply take a look and see through other calls what groups the administrators were in. So when I went to make this post request, if I just changed the group IDs to be in their group IDs, the web application itself didn't let me see it. The mobile application didn't let me see it. But when I looked at the underlying code, I did see my group IDs. Change it, submit it, and boom, I was in the system administrators group. So in this case, the user, if there's malicious intent or a malicious actor gains access to a set of credentials, could elevate their privileges to, gain further access into the system. Now, some of these types of vulnerabilities can be caught with an automated scanning solution, but I would highly recommend that a penetration tester evaluate the security of APIs for these types of vulnerabilities on a more manual basis. These types of vulnerabilities often include specially crafted packets and a really good understanding of the application's logical flow, just to try and get them to exploit. APIs are typically flat. They have a decent set of confined rules. It's just data stored in a container that's being retrieved or being updated somewhere. Without all the GUI fluff, the attack surface is harder to manipulate. It's not impossible, it's just harder. So an automated scanner can only do so much. And on top of that, the scanners generally aren't designed for exploitation and risk analysis the way that penetration tester is going to step up to the plate. Okay, number 7, security misconfigurations. This category is pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to cover it too far in depth. So I mean, really here on the screen, I've just copied the OWASP write-up for your viewing pleasure. Ultimately, it comes down to hardening issues. These are normal security-related risks that are often going to be found either through vulnerability scanner or from a penetration tester taking a look at a web application, a mobile application, the underlying API. Missing security patches is a really big one. But I don't think I've had a report to any of our clients in at least the last 6 months where there wasn't some cross-site scripting or cross-site request forgery or server-side injection that was possible from a vulnerable third-party library like jQuery or this escapes me at the moment, but the different third-party libraries that they come in, those are under constant attack and they're under constant update. So one of the biggest things here that you can do to combat security misconfigurations is trust your scanners in these ones. The scanners come up pretty darn accurate. They may give an excessive amount of data that's really hard to read through or gets confusing at times. Anyone who has used a vulnerability scanner against a website and it has checked for weak TLS, it'll come out with like 50 different vulnerabilities. Like, oh, you're vulnerable to the breach. You're vulnerable to the robot. You're vulnerable to the beast. You're vulnerable to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When simply it could just, it can be condensed by a penetration tester and saying that you just need to go harden your TLS settings. Speaking of which, I'm going to get on another small soapbox here. If you're in charge of the TLS encryption for your web applications, your APIs, WebSockets, etc., make sure that you're trying to make sure you're starting now to try and deploy version 1.3. There's a lot of really great enhancement from version 1.3 versus the other. You should be using version 1.2 or above, but the biggest thing here from 1.2 to 1.3 is that it's the enforcement of ephemeral keys for key exchange and for data exchange. And many of the cyber suites that are in TLS 1.2 are, they use RSA, which is outdated and considered insecure at this point. And they also use CBC ciphers. So I'll get off my soapbox. I was a cryptologist for many years in the Navy, and this one really does get to me. But ultimately, security misconfigurations are just a common hardening of the system, the environment, how the data is transferred, how the data is stored, etc. And number 8. Okay, so number 8 is injection. So unlike mass assignment, injection is anything that you can think of in that case. So I don't know why, I guess I can understand why OWASP actually breaks this out to talk specifically about injection, but ultimately never trust user supplied data. Always validate the variables and sanitize input. The security community has been harping on that line, never trust user supplied data, for years. But I personally feel like we need to change this to do not trust any field that could be subject to input or data tampering. So for instance, on the right, we see here an example of command injection where the site ID, which is normally, for this particular IoT device rather, was normally set hard-coded for that user's response. Pardon me. So when the user would actually make a request, it would transfer over the site ID. As in the user didn't actually have access to change the site ID. There's no drop-down menu, no enter my ID, things like that. But you could, through a curl request, just force it and say, hey, my site ID equals and a number, and that would be your site ID. Well, in this case, we could also give it a command. So this was running on a Linux environment. We gave it the command for adding a user with our company name for CTech. We added it to the sudo group, and then we made sure that it had a bin bash shell, and we set a username and password. And the reason for this is that IoT device also had SSH open and wasn't protecting SSH with any type of public-private keys. So these types of vulnerabilities can be found with an automated scanner, but normally, just like mass assignment, the vulnerability scanners are not prone to try and actually exploit your system. They look for a possibility and they can set up a flag. That doesn't mean that you'll possibly get a lot more false positives. Exploitation like this is it does exist. We see it all the time, but for the number of devices, number of APIs, it's actually fairly low on that top 10 list. A scanner might find a fault when testing the API endpoint on the screen, but a penetration tester is going to be better at evaluating that risk and then taking that further, exploiting it through the actual injection process and judging that risk. Pardon me. So there are that really kind of concludes the heavy technical portion, but if you're in the management team or you're in IT and you're dealing with the security testing considerations, there are certain things that you want to take a look at when it comes to APIs, and that is an API can range. We've seen it from as little as like 3 or 4 just endpoints that handle just a very small micro movement of data to run a small function or update an analytic piece, to well into the thousands of endpoints. The larger your API is, the more time and resources it actually takes to do that security process. I mean, it kind of goes without saying, really, but it is something that I think a lot of organizations lack when they are taking into consideration of how do we actually pen test. We need to actually consider the size of that. For developers, if you're in the development of a web application, mobile application, or just straight up APIs, or you work with APIs in any of those combinations, you know that as you add new features, APIs have to be updated, the rules and permission sets have to be updated. So they undergo a constant development. We often see with our clients that there is a lack of documentation. This is one of the first of the top 10 that I actually spoke about, and that's improper asset management. When you lack documentation, developers forget to, they might create functions for testing purposes or debugging, but they leave it undocumented, and then it actually gets pushed into production where it's found by somebody else and bad things happen. So making sure that before you get to that testing of your API, your documentation really should be on par. Make sure you're putting in that extra little bit of time to make that you're updating everything. Access levels and permissions are trending towards being granular and giving the end user or clients so much more ability to do a lot more and give people that real true feel of ownership over an application and break down those permissions. The more permissions you have, the more rules or roles you have, the more time it's going to take. In which case, you probably want to pair an automated scanning solution with a penetration tester. When it comes to traditional penetration testing, there are some things that can make traditional pen testing just kind of ineffective. Black box leaves gaps. I never recommend to any of our clients that they ever test an API in a black box. I know that sounds really cool and you want to just maybe see what a malicious actor can see under the hood, but at the same time, you're going to end up with gaps. if a malicious actor may have way more time to sit there and slowly, methodically approach an application or an API versus penetration tester or consultant who's got a very short amount of time. It's trying to do as much as possible within a shortened window. So that kind of environment doesn't really give you a really good return on investment. Now, if you are balancing between vulnerability scanner and a traditional pen tester, you generally see a better return on investment because if you're using a vulnerability scanner, you can narrow down those false positives and redirect your efforts into what you need to do, and then a penetration tester can actually look at the system holistically rather than from just machine output. So it gives a lot more in-depth analysis. But then again, manual analysis can also be quite time consuming. So it's just something else to take into consideration. Lastly, if you do not own the API, it doesn't mean you can't test it. If you're working with a company where you're going to be providing API access through certified healthcare IT, you are responsible for that. So what are some of the things that you can do as far as the testing goes? You can either test it yourself, in which case you have to work with the vendor to make sure that you're getting their documentation from them, or you can actually work with the vendor and make sure that they are following testing guidelines, that they're following compliance. Ask them for a letter of attestation to show that it was penetrated and it went through a risk assessment of some kind, whether that's that they're keeping a solid practice of how they do it, what they're doing, what they found, and what their remediation cycle looks like, and that someone independent tested them and came in and checked their remediation process as well. So those are all really good considerations when you're looking at it from the managerial perspective of how do I get this done within my environment. And then lastly, Synergistic has the API Sentry program. This is that vulnerability scanning portion, but it's continuous. So we can set it on a scheduled basis. We actually have somebody who goes through and analyzes the data to minimize those false positives. So it really allows the customer to focus on what is important. We rate out what the risk level is, how it impacts the system, and provide more of a guided path on what needs to be taken care of first, so you can organize your sprints through your CI/CD pipeline. We also offer in that process, rather than taking just some technical blurb spit out from a scanner, we provide full insight on how to actually remediate that or what steps need to be taken. And then finally, we come back in because it's continuous. We can come back in on a regular basis and just keep this process going. So it ends up being a much more cost-effective and less time-consuming process for the client. But if you want to know more information about this, please reach out to Synergistic or myself or Marty, anyone who's on the call here today.
Thank you, Andrew. And I know we just have a short little time to take one or two questions if there are any. I would just remind people that the recording of this session is going to be posted on our website. We have a couple of other podcasts that we've done on the interoperability and the information blocking rules. And I'll put a plug in the very near term. We're going to be publishing an ebook for the information blocking and interoperability rules that goes into a fair amount of detail specific to what providers need to do for information blocking, or what we're suggesting providers should be thinking about doing, as well as what providers and payers need to be doing in order to comply with the interoperability rule. So keep an eye out on our website for that. It's on the cusp of being ready for publication. So just be aware of that. For current clients, I think we're going to send out an e-blast that lets you know it's out there. And again, if there's any other questions you have or things we can help you with, either on the technical side or on the general, complying with the rules and what the rules are actually saying side, please feel free to reach out. I don't see any questions in the Q&A tab. So with that, I'm going to turn it we're going to close out the conference, and we appreciate very much everybody's time and attention on this. Thank you.